The fall of Constantinople in 1453 was not just the collapse of a city, it was the end of an entire world. For more than 1,000 years, the great Byzantine capital had stood as the last beacon of Christian power in the East, surrounded by the growing might of the Ottoman Empire. But when Sultan Mehmed II, barely 21 years old, set his eyes on the city, the fate of its people, including the devoted Christian nuns, was sealed. As the siege began, the air was thick with fear and prayer. Inside the towering walls, churches echoed with chants asking for divine mercy, while outside, cannons roared and Ottoman soldiers shouted war cries that made even the bravest hearts tremble. The nuns in the city's many convents clung to their faith, believing that God would protect them from what lay beyond those walls. They prayed day and night, lighting candles before icons of the Virgin Mary, hoping for a miracle that would never come. On the morning of May 29th, the miracle turned to horror. The city's defenders, exhausted and outnumbered, could no longer hold the gates. When the massive bronze doors of Constantinople finally broke, the invaders flooded in like a storm. The streets that once rang with church bells now echoed with screams. Blood mixed with dust as steel met flesh, and centuries of civilization were reduced to chaos within hours. For the Christian nuns, this was the beginning of a nightmare beyond imagination. Many of them had never stepped outside their convents. Their lives were dedicated to silence, prayer, and purity. But on that day, silence turned into terror as the Ottoman soldiers advanced toward the monasteries and churches, their torches burning with hunger for conquest. In the convent of St. Thecla, dozens of nuns barricaded the doors, clutching wooden crosses as they whispered the Lord's Prayer. They could hear the clash of swords outside, the thundering of hooves, and the chilling laughter of men drunk on victory. Some nuns tried to hide in cellars. Others ran to the chapel and fell to their knees before the altar. They thought the sanctity of their vows would protect them. But when the doors were broken down, the invaders showed no mercy. To the Ottomans, the city was the spoils of war. Every living being inside its walls was property to be claimed, men for labor, women for pleasure, and children for slavery. The nuns were no exception. Their white robes, symbols of purity, became targets of ridicule. The invaders mocked their faith, tore their veils, and dragged them through the streets as trophies of conquest. Some soldiers forced the women to renounce their religion, promising safety if they converted to Islam. Most refused, choosing humiliation over betrayal of Christ. In the Church of the Holy Apostles, one of the city's oldest and most sacred places, dozens of nuns had gathered, believing no soldier would dare defile holy ground. But even the church offered no refuge. The Ottomans stormed in, overturning icons, breaking crucifixes, and desecrating the altars. The cries of the women blended with the crash of shattered marble as centuries of devotion were destroyed in minutes. The few who managed to escape the massacre ran into the city's narrow alleys, hiding among the dead or in abandoned homes. Some disguised themselves as beggars, cutting their hair and smearing their faces with ash. But even in disguise, their fate was cruel. The Ottoman patrols searched every corner for survivors. Captured nuns were taken to camps outside the city walls, where their torment continued under the watchful eyes of their captors. The chroniclers who survived the siege wrote of these horrors with trembling hands. They described scenes so dark that even they hesitated to put them to paper. Some nuns were sold in the slave markets of Edirne and Bursa, their identities erased, their lives turned into endless servitude. Others simply vanished, their names lost to history but their suffering preserved in whispers passed down through generations. Yet, amidst this darkness, some acts of faith shone like faint stars. A few nuns, realizing there was no escape, chose death over dishonor. In one account, a group of sisters locked themselves inside a small chapel and began to sing hymns as the soldiers battered the doors. They sang louder with each blow, their voices rising above the chaos until flames consumed the building and silence fell. They died believing their souls would rise untainted to the heavens. Outside, the once golden city was drenched in smoke and blood. The Hagia Sophia, the grand jewel of Christendom, had fallen. Its doors, once open only to worshippers, now swung wide for the conquerors. Inside, terrified citizens, men, women and nuns had gathered, clutching their faith as their only defense. But when Mehmed's troops entered, the sacred chants turned into cries. The great dome that had witnessed centuries of prayer now echoed with despair. By nightfall, Constantinople was no longer Christian. It was Ottoman. The convents were looted, their relics melted, their manuscripts burned or stolen. The surviving nuns were scattered, enslaved, or forced into conversion. The city that had once been the heart of Eastern Christianity now beat to the rhythm of a different faith. Yet even in defeat, the memory of what happened to those women remained unforgotten. Their suffering became a symbol of the fall itself, a reminder that the end of Constantinople was not only the death of an empire but the desecration of a faith's most innocent souls. In the centuries that followed, their story lived on in silence, buried beneath the grandeur of Ottoman history. But for those who still whispered prayers in the ruins of the old churches, the screams of the nuns who faced that dreadful night could still be heard in the wind. The fall of the city was recorded in dates and names, but what the Ottomans did to those women, the fear, the shame, the faith that held until the last breath, was something history could never fully capture. It was not merely the end of a city. It was the moment when holiness itself was broken, and the world stood silent before the echoes of its own cruelty. For the Christian nuns who survived the fall of Constantinople, the nightmare did not end when the city's walls crumbled. In many ways, it had only just begun. Once captured by the Ottoman soldiers, they were faced with a merciless choice: abandon their faith and accept conversion to Islam, or face the grim reality of slavery. There was no middle ground, no mercy, no sanctuary left to hide within. The vow of chastity that once symbolized their devotion to God became the very chain that sealed their suffering. The Ottoman Empire had long considered Christian captives as the rightful spoils of war. Under the law of conquest, the victors could claim both property and people as rewards. When Constantinople fell, tens of thousands were enslaved, and among them were the nuns women who had renounced worldly desires, only to be forced into the most degrading forms of bondage. For Mehmed II and his generals, these captives were more than mere prisoners. They were living trophies of a civilization brought to its knees. The forced conversions began almost immediately. Ottoman clerics were brought into the camps where captured women were gathered. They promised freedom and protection to any who would utter the Shahada, the Islamic declaration of faith. Some, broken by exhaustion and terror, whispered the words in trembling voices, hoping to escape torment. But for most, conversion was not an act of belief, it was the final betrayal of everything they had lived for. Many chose silence instead, refusing to speak even when threatened with the lash or the blade. Their faith was all they had left, and they clung to it as if it were the last breath of their souls. Those who refused were branded as stubborn infidels. They were marched in chains to the slave markets of the empire Edirne, Bursa, and eventually Istanbul, which was already being reshaped into the new Ottoman capital. The sight of veiled women in white habits drew crowds, for it was rare and shocking to see nuns, symbols of purity and holiness, reduced to commodities. Traders appraised them like livestock, discussing their age, beauty, and health, while ignoring the quiet despair in their eyes. Many were purchased by wealthy Ottoman officials, or taken directly into the imperial harems. Inside these lavish prisons, the nuns faced the most profound form of humiliation. They were forced to shed their religious garments and wear silks meant for concubines. Their rosaries were taken from them, replaced with jewels they never desired. Some were renamed, given Turkish or Arabic names to erase their pasts. Their captors saw their resistance as pride, something to be broken, and their purity as a challenge to be conquered. It was not simply physical enslavement, it was the deliberate destruction of their spiritual identity. In the harems, the rules were absolute. Disobedience could mean death. Those who tried to escape were publicly punished, their suffering used as a warning to others. Some nuns found ways to fight back, quietly praying in secret, tracing the sign of the cross under their breath when no one was looking. A few even took their own lives, believing that death would reunite them with the God they refused to betray. The chroniclers of that era, both Christian and Muslim, recorded these stories with varying tones. Ottoman writers glorified the conquest, describing how the city was purified and its people subdued. But among the Christian scribes who survived, the tone was one of mourning and outrage. They wrote of sisters who vanished into the folds of the empire, their faith extinguished by force or their voices silenced forever. The tragedy was not only in their suffering but in the erasure of their existence. Some of these women, after years of captivity, were seen again not as nuns, but as servants or wives within the households of their conquerors. They spoke little, their eyes distant, their pasts buried under layers of silence. The few who managed to escape and reach Christian lands were never the same. Their confessions to priests and monks revealed tales of cruelties so deep that listeners wept. They told of nights spent in chains, of being mocked for their prayers, and of being forced to choose between their God and their life. For them, survival itself was both a miracle and a curse. The forced conversions also carried a political message. Mehmed II wanted to show the world that Islam had triumphed over Christianity. The enslavement of nuns, the violation of convents, and the mass conversions were not random acts of cruelty, they were symbols of domination. Every nun who bent her head was proof that the Christian world had bowed to the will of the new empire. This act of psychological warfare spread fear across Europe. The stories that reached Venice, Rome, and Florence painted the Ottomans as destroyers of faith, and the captured nuns as martyrs of purity. In churches far away from the ruins of Constantinople, priests spoke their names in whispers, comparing their trials to those of early Christian saints who faced the lions of Rome. But these women were not remembered in grand monuments or marble statues. Their graves were unmarked, their final prayers unheard by the world. The Ottomans had taken their bodies, but they could not entirely claim their souls. For even in captivity, many of them remained defiant in secret ways. Some continued to pray beneath the stars when their captors slept, using pebbles as rosary beads. Others taught their faith quietly to children born in slavery, passing on fragments of the beliefs the empire tried to erase. Their quiet rebellion became an invisible thread that wove through the generations. The story of the nuns who faced forced conversion or slavery is a story of ultimate endurance, the endurance of faith when stripped of everything else. They were not warriors or queens. They had no armies or crowns. Yet in their refusal to submit, they carried a strength that defied empires. Their suffering revealed the cruelest truth of conquest, that true victory is not only in the taking of land, but in the breaking of spirit. And yet, even when their bodies were owned, their spirits remained unbroken. In the grand palaces of their captors, among the gold and perfume and shadows, the echoes of their whispered prayers continued to haunt the silence. They had been given a choice between faith and freedom, and many chose faith, even when it meant losing everything else. The desecration of convents and churches during the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople was one of the darkest chapters in the city's long and glorious history. For centuries, these holy places had stood as sanctuaries of peace, their walls echoing with hymns and prayers. The nuns who lived within them were women who had renounced the world's pleasures, dedicating their lives to faith, silence, and service. But when the Ottomans breached the walls on May 29, 1453, those sacred sanctuaries became scenes of unholy chaos. To the invaders, the city was a prize to be taken, its treasures a reward for victory, and its holy sites mere buildings to be stripped of their symbols and turned into spoils. The destruction began with a fury that seemed unstoppable. Soldiers poured into the city like a flood, their swords glinting under the red light of burning rooftops. They had been promised 3 days to plunder, and they took it as divine permission. The first targets were the churches that dotted the city. These magnificent structures filled with gold mosaics, silver icons, and jeweled relics became irresistible to the invaders. The Church of the Holy Apostles, where Byzantine emperors had been buried for centuries, was torn apart. Marble altars were smashed, icons of Christ and the Virgin Mary were defaced, and the golden chalices used in communion were melted down for coin. But the destruction was not just physical, it was deeply symbolic. The Ottomans wanted to show that the old world was gone, that Christianity's might had fallen, and Islam now reigned supreme. The convents, which had once been safe havens for women of faith, became places of horror. Soldiers burst through their doors, shouting in languages the nuns did not understand. The air filled with smoke and screams as the invaders looted everything from the altars to the kitchens. Candles were torn from stands and used to set curtains aflame. Sacred manuscripts, painstakingly copied by generations of scribes, were thrown into the fire or used to light torches. The nuns, who had lived quiet lives of devotion, found themselves dragged from their cells, their cries ignored. Some clung to crosses, others begged for mercy, but their captors only laughed. The invaders saw no holiness in their victims, only conquest and possession. In the eyes of the victors, these women were symbols of a defeated faith, and humiliating them became part of the victory itself. There were accounts of soldiers dancing mockingly in front of desecrated altars, singing battle songs where hymns once rang. Chalices were filled with wine stolen from the churches, and sacred vestments were worn as trophies. The relics of saints were ripped from their cases, their bones tossed aside as worthless. The invaders did not simply plunder. They defiled, seeking to erase not just the body of the city, but its soul. One of the most tragic scenes unfolded in the Hagia Sophia, the grandest church of all Christendom. As the Ottoman forces entered, they found it packed with terrified citizens, men, women, and children who had sought refuge inside its walls. Among them were many nuns who had fled from surrounding convents, clutching icons and whispering prayers. They believed the house of God would protect them. But when the soldiers broke through the massive bronze doors, the sanctity of the place was shattered. The marble floors that had felt the footsteps of emperors and saints were now stained with blood. The invaders looted the treasures, tore down the icons, and mocked the priests who dared to resist. Within hours, the Hagia Sophia was transformed from a church into a mosque, its golden mosaics whitewashed, its crosses replaced with crescents. The nuns who had prayed for deliverance now faced their worst fears. Some were taken captive within the very church they had once served, their cries drowned by the sounds of conquest. The desecration spread beyond the walls of the city as well. In nearby monasteries, soldiers destroyed libraries filled with centuries of Christian knowledge. Paintings and manuscripts that told the story of the faith were either burned or stolen to be sold in distant markets. The convent gardens, once places of quiet reflection, were trampled and turned into camps for the soldiers. The holy bells that once called the faithful to prayer now hung silent, broken, and melted into weapons. The destruction of these sacred places sent shockwaves across the Christian world. In Rome, Venice, and Florence, reports of the atrocities spread like wildfire. Artists painted scenes of burning churches, priests slain at the altar, and nuns dragged away in chains. The news was not just a record of defeat. It was a wound to the soul of Christendom. For centuries, Constantinople had been more than a city. It was the symbol of divine order, the bridge between heaven and earth. Now it lay in ashes, its sanctuaries profaned, its holy relics scattered to the winds. The Ottomans, in their victory, sought to erase every sign of the old empire. They converted churches into mosques, monasteries into barracks, and convents into prisons. The sound of church bells was replaced by the call to prayer. The holy icons were hidden or destroyed, replaced by the plain walls of Islamic architecture. Yet amid this devastation, some Christians secretly preserved what they could. A few brave souls risked death to hide sacred relics beneath the ruins or smuggle them out of the city. Some nuns who escaped captivity carried with them fragments of icons or pages from holy books, clinging to them as reminders of what had been lost. In exile, these fragments became relics of a fallen world, a symbol of faith that refused to die. The desecration of Constantinople's holy places was not just a military act. It was an attempt to rewrite history, to prove that one faith had triumphed completely over another. But even as the Ottomans raised their banners over the city's skyline, the memory of what they had destroyed lived on. Every burned convent, every defiled altar, every stolen relic became a silent testimony to the cruelty of conquest. The nuns who suffered that day may have been silenced, but their faith left a mark that time could not erase. Their prayers, once spoken softly in the candlelit halls of their convents, now echoed through the ruins, an unbroken song of sorrow and defiance. The conquerors could take the churches, the gold, and the walls, but they could not truly claim the spirit of those who died defending them. The desecration of Constantinople was complete, but in the ashes of destruction, a quiet form of resistance remained, the unyielding memory of a sanctity that even fire and sword could not destroy. Amidst the smoke, blood, and despair that followed the fall of Constantinople, a quiet resistance began to take shape, a resistance not born of swords or shields, but of faith and defiance. The Christian nuns, stripped of their sanctuaries and surrounded by enemies, faced a choice no human should ever have to make: submit to the conquerors or die with dignity. For many of them, the decision was already made in their hearts. These were women who had sworn vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience not to kings or emperors, but to God Himself. Their lives had been dedicated to silence and service. But when silence turned into oppression, their devotion became their final weapon. The stories of these women's final acts were whispered by survivors, passed down through generations like sacred scripture. In the convent of St. Euphemia, When Ottoman soldiers broke down the gates, the nuns gathered in the chapel instead of fleeing. Their abbess, an elderly woman who had lived her entire life behind those stone walls, told them that their bodies might be taken, but their souls belonged to heaven. The sisters joined hands, sang hymns of resurrection, and prayed as the invaders approached. When the soldiers entered, they found not terrified victims but women standing in rows, their eyes closed in unshakable peace. Many were killed where they stood, but they died as they had lived in devotion, not fear. Other convents across the city saw similar acts of courage. Some nuns set fire to their own buildings, preferring to die in the smoke rather than be enslaved. The smell of burning wood and incense mingled with the screams outside as these women embraced martyrdom. Chroniclers later wrote of nuns who jumped from the walls of their convents into the Bosporus, choosing the dark waters over the hands of their conquerors. Their final prayers were for forgiveness, not for themselves, but for those who would commit these acts against them. Even in the heart of chaos, some were saved by the compassion of ordinary people. Greek families, still dazed by the destruction of their city, risked everything to shelter the surviving sisters. They hid them in cellars, behind false walls, or smuggled them out disguised as peasants. These acts of mercy were punishable by death under Ottoman rule, but some refused to stand by while women of God were dragged away. A few sympathetic Muslim soldiers, shocked by the brutality around them, also turned a blind eye or secretly helped nuns escape through the city's ruined gates. In the mountains and villages beyond the city, small groups of these survivors found refuge. They built hidden chapels from the rubble of their old lives, praying in silence so as not to be discovered. Many lived the rest of their days in secrecy, keeping alive the rituals and hymns of Byzantium that the conquerors had tried to erase. These scattered women became living relics of the old faith, symbols of a world that refused to die. Some chroniclers describe how a few of these escaped nuns later became teachers in hidden Christian communities, helping to preserve the Greek language and Orthodox traditions under Ottoman rule. In their whispered prayers and secret gatherings, the light of faith flickered on, however faintly. What makes their resistance remarkable is not just their courage, but its purity. They had no weapons, no armies, and no hope of victory in the earthly sense. Their defiance was spiritual, a refusal to let their captors claim their souls. The Ottomans could destroy churches and enslave bodies, but they could not conquer faith that refused to yield. In the centuries that followed, these stories of silent rebellion became part of Christian folklore. Priests told them in secret liturgies, comparing the nuns of Constantinople to the early martyrs of Rome who had faced lions in the arena. Their names were often lost, but their acts lived on in legend. The nun who threw her rosary into the flames before stepping in after it. The abbess who tore down her veil and declared she would wear it only before God. The sisters who sang hymns as their convent burned around them. Each story was a fragment of light breaking through the darkness of history. Even the conquerors seemed to sense that these women's defiance carried a power they could not erase. Some Ottoman chroniclers mention them briefly, noting their bravery with a kind of reluctant respect. One wrote that the Christian women chose death as if it were a feast, an observation meant to belittle but instead immortalize their strength. Over time, the memory of their resistance became intertwined with the legend of Constantinople's fall itself. To the Christian world, their deaths symbolized the fall of the old empire, but also the endurance of the spirit that had built it. They were not warriors, yet they fought the most human of battles, the one between fear and faith. Their silence became their weapon, their prayers their armor. Even as the minarets rose above the skyline and the sound of church bells faded forever, the quiet legacy of these nuns endured. Travelers in later centuries spoke of hearing faint singing from the ruins of old convents, as if their souls had never left. Others claimed that on the anniversary of the city's fall, the wind through the Hagia Sophia's dome carried the echo of a hymn once sung by those who died praying beneath it. Whether these were legends or echoes of truth, no one could say, but they revealed a deeper reality: the spirit of resistance cannot be burned or buried. In a world reshaped by conquest, these nuns represented the last defenders of a vanishing faith. They had nothing left to lose, yet in losing everything, they gained immortality. Their courage was not written in the chronicles of kings or carved into monuments, but it lived in the quiet hearts of those who remembered. Their final act of defiance was not to fight, but to remain faithful, even when faith itself seemed doomed. The fall of Constantinople may have marked the end of an empire, but through the courage of those silent women, it also marked the birth of a legend that no sword could silence, no empire could erase. Centuries after the fall of Constantinople, the memory of what the Ottomans did to the Christian nuns still lingers like a shadow over history. The story of their suffering has been passed down through generations, not just as a tale of cruelty, but as a testament to unbreakable faith. These women, stripped of everything, home, safety, identity, became symbols of defiance in the face of unspeakable darkness. Their martyrdom was not recorded in royal chronicles or celebrated in triumphal songs. It survived in whispers, in prayers, and in the haunted silence of old churches rebuilt from ashes. Their legacy became something greater than history. It became a warning and a lesson about the power of conviction when faced with tyranny. The stories of the nuns spread throughout Europe like a ghostly echo of a fallen world. In monasteries from Venice to Moscow, monks copied accounts of their final moments by candlelight, ensuring their courage would never be forgotten. Artists painted visions of veiled women standing unbroken amid fire and swords. Poets called them the brides of heaven, women who refused to betray their vows even as their world collapsed around them. Their lives were gone, but their defiance turned them into saints of memory. What made their story endure was not just the tragedy but the transformation of their pain into strength. Their deaths became a symbol of the endurance of faith, proving that no empire, no matter how powerful, could erase the spiritual truth that lived in their hearts. The Ottoman conquest had aimed to break not only a city but a belief system. Yet the very women they tried to destroy became immortal in the eyes of those who remembered them. Every convent that was burned, every chapel desecrated, became part of a greater story of resistance, a story that transcended politics and faith and spoke to something universal in the human spirit. The chronicles tell of one nun, captured during the fall, who refused to renounce her God even after years of slavery. Her captors mocked her, saying her prayers were worthless in a world ruled by new masters. She answered calmly that empires fall, but faith endures. Her words outlived her captors, echoing through the centuries as a reminder that power is fleeting but conviction is eternal. Others were remembered not by name but by deed: the nun who set her convent ablaze rather than be taken, the one who sang psalms as she was dragged away in chains, the group who walked together into the sea holding crosses above the waves until they disappeared beneath them. These stories, half history and half legend, became part of the Christian identity that emerged from the ruins of Byzantium. They showed that even in defeat, there could be victory of spirit. The Church canonized some of these women as martyrs in the centuries that followed, though many remained anonymous. Their names may have been lost, but their courage was not. Priests spoke of them in secret masses during Ottoman rule, teaching that their suffering was not in vain. Their example gave strength to generations of believers who lived under oppression, reminding them that true faith cannot be conquered by the sword. Even among the Ottomans, whispers of respect emerged. Some chroniclers, despite glorifying the conquest, wrote of the nuns' bravery with a kind of awe. They could not understand how women with no power, no weapons, and no hope could face death with such serenity. One Turkish historian centuries later described them as the ones who chose heaven over earth, recognizing, perhaps unintentionally, that their resistance had elevated them beyond mere victims. The legacy of these women also transformed the way later generations saw martyrdom. Their story was not about vengeance or hatred, it was about endurance, about holding on to one's soul when the world demands its surrender. Artists of the Renaissance and Baroque eras used their memory as a symbol of inner strength. Paintings showed them surrounded by flames yet untouched, faces serene as if illuminated from within. Their suffering became a metaphor for spiritual purity, a reminder that true sanctity is tested in the fires of despair. In modern times, historians debate the details of their fate, questioning the accuracy of medieval accounts. Some claim that the stories were exaggerated, shaped by propaganda or religious emotion. But even if the lines between truth and legend blur, the meaning remains. Every culture needs its martyrs figures who embody the best of humanity in its darkest hours. For the Christians of the fallen East, those nuns were exactly that. They were the proof that holiness could survive even the most brutal of empires. Their legacy also shaped the identity of the survivors of Byzantium. Families who fled to Greece, Italy, and Russia carried with them not just relics and icons, but the memory of the women who refused to yield. In exile, they built new convents and churches dedicated to the martyrs of Constantinople. The candles they lit were more than acts of mourning, they were declarations that faith, once lit, can never truly be extinguished. Even today, echoes of their story remain in Orthodox prayers and hymns. Their suffering is remembered not as a tale of defeat, but as one of triumph, a triumph of the soul over the sword, of light over darkness. Their courage continues to inspire, reminding humanity that true power lies not in conquest, but in conscience. They stood unarmed before armies, yet it was their spirit that endured. The Ottomans took their city, their freedom, and their lives, but they could not take their faith. In the end, it was the conquerors who faded into the pages of history, while the memory of those nuns became eternal. They are remembered as the guardians of a faith that refused to die, the last voices of a world consumed by war yet reborn through sacrifice. Their martyrdom stands as a timeless truth that even in the face of cruelty worse than death, the human spirit, when anchored in faith, can rise above everything that seeks to destroy it.